Well, greetings from the West Island. Seriously, I bring greetings from the 187,000 strong Australian Education Union and my own union, the New South Wales Teachers Federation, our membership of 60,000. If this was a conference in Australia, I would begin by acknowledging country, the Indigenous people on whose land we were meeting. I would say in Sydney, for instance, that I acknowledge that we're meeting on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay respects to elders past and present. So I want to, in a way, give that acknowledgement here and pay respects to your elders who are present with us today. In the few minutes that I've got, I want to just give you a report on what's happening in my country, Australia, and put it in a kind of context of how we're disrupting a very powerful agenda that we probably are all facing. It's time that we borrowed that phrase from the environmental movement to think globally, but we need to act at every level. Public education is under attack. It's no longer just what's happening at a state or a national level. We need to kind of get our eyes above our navels, all of us right across the world as teachers, and see the connections and have a global perspective on what is happening and relate to what's happening in your school and your districts and your country to what's happening elsewhere. A united teacher movement across the world is more important than ever. And the greatest threat, of course, is the massive privatisation in and of education in its many forms. And you might recognise these kinds of features of the global attack. You know, put your hand up if there's any elements up there that could be true to your country. And absolutely. So breaking up the system, making schools autonomous and smashing the system, funding cuts, testing regimes, politicising school curriculum, loss of permanency, wage freezes or salary caps, attacks on teaching qualifications, what the very notion of a teacher. If you were to Google unqualified teaching jobs, don't do it now, wait till I finish, but unqualified teaching jobs UK. And what you will see come up on your screen will be thousands and thousands and thousands of ads in the UK for teachers who are being asked to come and teach but who don't have a qualification. So it'll be unqualified maths teacher, unqualified science teacher, unqualified primary teacher. So this is a real issue. Technology, and I'll talk about that in a moment, the demonising of public schools and of course their unions and the commercial privatisation of public education. If we could go to most parts, certainly of OECD countries, we would recognise so much of that. Of course, what's really happening, of course, is it's part of an economic theory that the public sphere, the public good, should not be funded, taxes should be lowered, and if you give tax breaks to the wealthy, we've just given a $17 billion cut to the wealthiest corporations in Australia, most of whom have never paid tax in their lives, and we've also had a $17 billion cuts to education as well. So it's the economic kind of reality that we're facing. And it's been a long time coming, this kind of right-wing agenda. Milton Friedman, the architect of neoliberalism, of course, said that public education was an island of socialism in a free market society. You can see what started off as lunacy has now become mainstream politics. So how are we fighting back? So this is what I just want to concentrate in the few minutes that I've got. I'm going to just talk very quickly about our fair funding campaign, our testing, our fight against standardised testing. Never, ever, ever allow it. And of course the attacks on, if I've got time, just quickly the attacks on vocational education. Australia is regarded in the OECD as having the most, certainly one of the most inequitable education systems on the planet. We may be a first world country, but the Australian education system is extraordinarily unequal. We have had for now nearly 5 decades a shift of funding away from public schools to private schools, Catholic and independent schools that are not part of our public system. They are exempted from anti-discrimination legislation. They discriminate against who they enrol. They do not have to enrol local children or kids with disabilities. They can exclude on the grounds of race or religion, parents' capacity to pay, or anything they like. They don't even have to declare. So we have a situation in Australia, for instance, where if you're looking at the poorest 25% of children in our country, 82% of them are enrolled in public schools, 11% in Catholics and 6% in the other independents. Yet, the funding is being shifted to the system that does not do the heavy lifting. So this is our fair funding campaign. At the heart of it is a notion calling the schooling resource standard, which is the amount of money that a school needs to get their kids across the line. And it was established under the previous Labor government, called the Gonski deal. That schooling resource standard is particularly important. But what's happening now is the Commonwealth funding in Australia is doing this. 80% of the Commonwealth's share of the schooling resource standard is going to the non-government system. 20% to the public system. It's legislated last June in the Australian public that the national government of our country's primary obligation in terms of funding is to the non-government system. We can't think of another country that has done that. So the system that's doing the heavy lifting, that educates the refugee kids, the kids with disability, with special needs, the Aboriginal children in some of the remotest parts on the planet, our poorest kids, kids from a non-English speaking background. Our system gets 20% of federal funding and the non-government system gets 80%. It's a perversion, and in many ways for us who are fighting this, it's come down to a moral question of what is right for our children in our schools. So 87% of public schools by 2023 will be below the schooling resource standard, yet by the same year, over 65% of the non-government system, the system that's allowed to discriminate, will be 65% will be over the 2023. Of the $2.2 billion that were cut from this year's funding and next year's funding, we lose $1.9 billion of that. And look at what we're doing in our system. These are just some of the schools in Australia getting federal and state funding. Remember this, these schools also get capital funding, that is funding to build buildings. The Commonwealth does not fund, the Commonwealth of Australia, the federal government, does not give one single dollar of capital funding to the public system, not a cent. Yet these schools are building, for instance in Sydney, a $25 million Scottish castle library. It gets, between those 2 years, an additional $10 million of recurrent funding as well. That's just their increase in funding. A school up the north coast above Sydney boasts the best dance studio outside of Sydney. It's a school, not a performing arts centre. Look at the increase in the funding that they get in recurrent, $23 million in 10 years of additional funding, in addition to what they're already receiving. King's School out at Parramatta has this hanging in the foyer. Gets a $19 million increase in government funding. These are some of the wealthiest Australians, the multi-millionaires, sending their kids to these schools. Pimsley College in Sydney are boasting that they're going to have a $100 million centenary project. Name me a school in New Zealand that boasts a $100 million centenary project. Because there's no public school in Australia that's doing it. Loreto Kirribilli, with views of Sydney Harbour. That school is already operating on public money alone, state and federal combined funding. They are already operating at 266% of the schooling resource standard. So we've got this campaign, we've got 4 R's to restore the $1.9 billion cut, to bring all schools to the 100% of the resource standard, to give capital funding from the Commonwealth to public schools and more support for students with disability. They're our 4 big R's that we'll take to the federal election. There's been an increase of about 120% of students identified with disability, yet the funding increase is 6%. And yet, only a week and a half ago, I have to now add this slide to presentations because it's got worse. You thought that was bad. A week and a half ago, the current Prime Minister, who will be here for this, I think he's the September Prime Minister of Australia, he certainly, after May 18th, when the federal election is called, we hope he's not going to be Prime Minister of anything, certainly not Australia. He has just announced, last Thursday week, an additional $4.6 billion to all non-government schools, regardless of need, and not $1 to the public system, not a cent. He said there'd be no special deals, and this is what he's done. He said there are no special deals. Well, at $4.6 billion to the non-government sector, even a former Tory National Party minister, Mr Pickley, has said it's throwing money at the powerful and well-connected, and he is right. Catholic schools, who often boast that they're a bit like a public school, and there's nothing in Australia further from the truth. These are schools, the enrolment growth in Catholic schools in Australia the last 10 years has come from non-Catholics. They are now become schools for social mobility and nothing more. They are also schools that exist to segregate. We have towns in New South Wales and different parts of Australia where the public schools enrol Indigenous children and the Catholic schools enrol the white kids. America used busing to desegregate their schools. We're using transport to segregate schools. And yet that's the kind of statistics we're facing. Some of the most powerful institutions, because we fight back with a bit of humour. This is the one I like. That's the Prime Minister. Everyone has to actually, it's because our Prime Minister's changed, the cartoonists barely can keep up with who it is. So sometimes we need to put an asterisk, as of now. The other issue I want to just quickly talk about in the time I've got is, and it's a kind of warning that we would do, and our friends from the US would give even a scarier story, and this notion of testing, the insanity of testing. Because it's based on this basic concept that whoever controls assessment controls what is taught and how it's taught. You control assessment, you control the supply chain of education. So we've got a testing regime called NAPLAN, the National Assessment Program for Literacy and Numeracy, and we're fighting hard against it. It's been 10 years. It has completely distorted the curriculum. It has led to children literally being scored for life. So we've got some experts on the case. Dr. Les Perlman from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology calls it one of the strangest writing tests he's ever seen. It's measuring all the wrong things. We've seen Professor Margaret Wu talk about our standardised testing, and she says it's so inaccurate. You can see why, a plus or minus of 12%. The margins of error are just so great that you can't look at it at school level, yet teachers are being hammered day in and day out to use this data to somehow make kind of assumptions about their children. If not to make it worse, of course, they then said that they will be bringing in a computer to mark the prose, children's prose, that it will be a computer that will mark students' writing. We fought against this last year, and we were successful in defeating the big, powerful companies like Pearson, who are trying to bring in these computerised marking. And what we did, we got our friend Les Perlman to actually look at the algorithms that the software was using to mark students' work. And with the same algorithms, we got them to create an essay. So we got an essay created. It took less than a second to get a 1,000-word essay based on 3 key words. And when you looked at that software and what was spat out by the computer, it was perfect English. The vocabulary, high concepts, perfect syntax, perfect punctuation, perfect grammar. Extraordinarily clever piece of writing that this computer spat out. Yet not one sentence made any sense at all. The computer then marked it and gave it a score of 99%. So we fought against this, and we will continue to fight against it with humour. Even the Sydney Morning Herald said that a system that removes assessment from human agency and hands it over to a machine shows disrespect for both teacher and pupil. Both are diminished by it. And of course, what happened when we went online, the data became incredibly invalid. So we are now got to a point in Australia after 10 years of campaigning against standardised testing. We've got many state ministers, not so much the federal minister, the current federal minister, I should say. We've got now them saying we have to have a review of the standardised testing program in Australia. We think we're on the verge of defeating it. It won't go easily. We're up against some of the most powerful companies around. But of course, as Steve Dinham from the University of Melbourne says, it's what we're fighting is not just education bureaucrats. This is part of the global response that we need. We are fighting some of the largest corporations around the world, and Pearson is just one of them. They are moving into education everywhere. And Paul and I are part of an EI team that have been fighting this as much as we can. But they want to effectively control the entire chain. Professor Steve Dinham said it's like a tsunami. When you notice it, it's too late. And we've got to start fighting it now. As we say, Pearson is always earning. Look, I just want to finish very quickly because in case you think that there's more good news, he'll finish with something upbeat. I won't. Other than to say that stay here. Because well, maybe a better message is do not copy anything we are doing. Do not copy. 2012, they marketised vocational education and training. They threw it open to a contestable funding model. And look what's happened. What has it done? We've had 260,000 fewer students. The private registered training organisations, some of them operating out of people's garages in their backyard, they're also down. So we've got now a 30% drop across Australia in the number of young people being trained in vocational education. 139,000 fewer completing courses. These kids are in debt for life. Their families are in debt for life with no qualifications. New South Wales, my home state, 42,000 fewer, and TAFE is down by 52,000. We've lost, since 2012 in New South Wales, we've lost a bit over 5,000 teachers and support staff have been sacked from the vocational education sector. So the Stop TAFE Cuts campaign is a very important and powerful campaign for us. And the private for-profit commercialisation is increasing. So that's what we answer. What has it done for vocational? That's what it's done. So can I just finish with this? This quote, I think, really goes to the heart of what it is to be a teacher, unionist and activist. It's advisable that the profession should understand, be able to criticise the general principles on which the whole education system is formed and administered. A teacher's not like a private soldier in an army expected to merely obey, or like a cog in a wheel expected merely to respond. The teacher must be an intelligent medium of action. One of the reasons why teaching unions and teachers are under attack all over the world is because we tend to be able to be articulate, we're literate, we're engaged with community, we have our children's interests at heart and our colleagues as well. And there's a lot of us. There's not a community somewhere where teachers don't exist, and they're more than likely to be union members. So you can see why we need to act. Now, that was said by John Dewey back in 1895. But that story and that message is just as true today as it has ever been. And you people, by coming to your union's conference, are part of being active cogs in the wheel to make this world a better place, not just for ourselves, but we want a fair go for all our kids. Thanks very much.